As a person who's of the preparedness mindset, there may come a time when you are forced to close the door on somebody in need. Let's talk about it. So I'm coming to your house when the you-know-what hits the fan is something that we often hear as preppers and survivalists. People tend to be facetious when they say this, and in turn, a lot of preppers tend to be quite defensive on the topic of I'm coming to your house when the you-know-what hits the fan. The rationale for this defensiveness, of course, is that if you are the only one on your street, or within your community for that matter, who has an ample supply of resources to carry them through tough times, through a crisis, through a disaster. First, the neighbor down the street knocks on your door and asks for stuff, and you, the benevolent person that you are, maybe provide them with a small amount of provisions to at least carry them through a few days. But then you get more knocks on the door, and this increases to a point where you are basically eaten out of house and home, if not overrun with physical brute force. That, of course, would be a dilemma that preppers will be faced with should people within your community know that you have supplies. And of course, eventually they will. You know, I've talked on this channel before about strategies you can use to mask the fact that you have supplies, be that cutting your calories and losing weight and essentially looking the part of a person who is in need, even though you technically are not in need, in order to keep attention away from you, or standing in the bread lines, whatever form they may come in, if need be, to make it look as though you are in need. But I think that eventually an act like that is only going to last so long. But that's not going to be the biggest challenge for people. The biggest dilemma for the majority of preppers is going to be resisting the urge to give, even though they don't have to. Now, I'm not talking about a 3-day to 1 week scenario like there's a winter storm and there's a power outage, like happened in Quebec, I believe, in the late 90s. There was a very large ice storm which took down the power grid for a manageable length of time. It wasn't a collapse of civilization scenario. You knew the power was coming back on. In a situation like that where you know that it's only going to be 30 days before the situation is resolved and you have 6 months to a year's worth of supplies stored, I think you would be remiss not to help your fellow man. I personally would feel morally responsible to help people out, and I would probably feel guilty if something happened to people as a result of not having resources. Like if we're talking about one of those short-term crisis scenarios and people were suffering and they didn't need to, if they had some of the provisions I had to offer, I would struggle in many ways, in more ways than one, not to help them out. And I'm sure most of you feel the same way. But at some point, if the situation is bad enough, you're going to be shutting the door in people's faces. And of course, we all know what the potential consequences of that are going to be. People, if they're in need, are not just going to roll over and lay down and die. People are going to do the same thing that you would do if your family was starving, is they're going to find a way to get food. And if that means stealing food from you with force, they will do it. So my personal strategy would be, if it was a short-term crisis scenario, I would help people out. And after the smoke cleared on that, I would make a concerted effort to convert those people to a preparedness mindset. And I think at that point, it would be fairly easy. Most people who've survived a prolonged crisis scenario, they don't need to be told to be preppers. There's a certain post-traumatic stress that happens that forces them into readiness. The same reason why a person who got robbed once now wants to carry some sort of self-defense tool. The same thing is going to happen with those people involved in that crisis. So I don't think that in helping people throughout that short-term crisis that they're going to be a future liability if the big one hits, because that would be the concern. Well, you help them that time, so now they know you're a prepper and they're going to be banging on your door every time there's a crisis. I don't think so. I think after that, and I think with some coaxing, you could convince them to become preppers. And I think they'd be far more apt to listen to you if you help them out. That said, in a long-term scenario, you can't be thinking with your heart, for lack of a better word. The reality is, you're not going to be able to save everybody. You may be able to save a few people, and you may want to strategically dole out some provisions for the sake of promoting some sort of stability within your community and minimizing harm to the greater good and yourself, of course, and your family, to build alliances and etc. But ultimately, you're going to have to say no to somebody. And it's going to suck because nobody wants to see anybody else suffer, at least 95% of the population who aren't psychopaths. I know there's going to be some people who feel they're going to be able to say no without having any remorse whatsoever. And that might be easy. It might be easy to say no when you are really down to the wire and you only have a few provisions left, just enough to get you by. But if you're sitting on a year's worth of food and people are literally starving around you, you're going to feel very guilty about that. I'm not saying you should feel guilty necessarily. I'm just saying as a human being who's not a psychopath, that's probably how you're going to feel. And I would expect that you are probably going to be as likely to willingly give up a lot of your preps out of the goodness of your heart, which of course may backfire on you in the long run, as you would lose it to looters, marauders, thieves, and people who are just trying to survive. And I'm not making apologies for their lack of preparedness. That's just what it's going to be. So how do you take a cold and calculated approach to this while retaining your humanity and doing the best you can for your community? Because at the end of the day, your community's security is your security. There's many concentric lines of defense that surround your home. One of those is the city limits. Then there's the community limits. Then there's the street limits. And then there's the limits of your own home. If your community is semi-stable after disaster, as a result of any contribution you can make, be that just having a presence, maybe that doesn't mean necessarily giving stuff to people, but maybe it just means being involved in some way, shape, or form. As preppers, typically I think we're averse to politics. I think the majority of preppers, I would venture to say, are probably introverted. So they're not extroverted, they're not social butterflies. I know I'm not. But the traditional thinking is that isolationist mindset would be defeated by the golden horde, by the masses of people who are unprepared, who are coming to get your stuff. But there's also going to be an internal war going on within you. And I don't think there's enough emphasis and enough talk within the emergency preparedness community, which is very much an isolationist thing at this point. The community is starting to mature, but by and large, it's still a lone wolf exercise. And by lone wolf, I also mean lone wolf families. Families isolating themselves from the greater community. Because really, there is no other choice in a lot of cases, because in most cases, most communities are not preparedness oriented. There may be some communities where disaster has struck, where it's more widely accepted and practiced. But in the average city within North America especially, prepping is not the in thing to do. In fact, in most cases, it's mocked and ridiculed, with the exception, of course, of the 3-day FEMA prepper, the ones that the government has convinced that you should have 3 days worth of food and water. Yeah, it's better than nothing. But we all know that 3 days worth of food and water is literally nothing. That's pretty much what people have in their house anyways. There was a time where it was normal for people to have 6 months worth of food stored at all times, constantly being cycled out, especially through the winter time. We've reached a point now with the just-in-time delivery system, and all of this food, in spite of all the preservatives, doesn't last long without proper refrigeration and storage. So that's why I always emphasize the importance of having those long-term food stores. So I pose this question to you, and you can leave a comment below if you so choose. All SHTF fantasy thinking aside, what are you going to do when you find yourself being the only one within your community who has stuff? And the neighbors who you kind of know on an acquaintance level, but they're obviously not your best friends. You don't have close ties with them. What are you going to do when everybody is knocking on your door? Because it's going to happen. It's going to happen. And it's probably going to end badly. I think the difference between the situation escalating quickly in a bad way or it remaining relatively calm and stable till the bitter end is going to be the result of how you play your cards. And I know there's so many variables to think about here because everybody's neighbors are different, but generally speaking, You know, the majority of the people in your neighborhood are pretty quiet. There's always going to be those loud mouths. I've made surveys before where I've asked people, you know, what would you do if the gangbanger came by your house and asked for stuff? Would you put him to work, or would you, what would you do, right? Because you always have to worry about the retaliation factor as well. If you were to do something to somebody, bear in mind they have friends and family. So, serious question for you today. So how are you going to deal with being the only person in your community to have stuff? Where are you going to draw the line? If it is a prolonged disaster scenario, we're talking more than 30 days. And I know it's very hard to say what would be more than 30 days. So I guess an event which would be bigger than Hurricane Katrina, national in scope perhaps. But even in the case of regional disasters, it could be a big enough regional disaster, like a major earthquake or something like that, that meant that help wasn't coming and things weren't going to be resolved for many, many months. So you need to make that call. Do you play hardball? Do you be the badass? Or do you take a more benevolent political approach? Because remember, people are assets. Humans are resources. If you can win the hearts and minds of the people, that's not preps wasted, in my opinion. In fact, that may be the only way you're going to survive in the long run. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Canadian Prepper out. The best way to support this YouTube channel is to support yourself by gearing up through CanadianPreparedness.com or BugoutRoll.ca. Premium quality gear at the best possible price using the incredibly secure and easy to use Shopify platform. We offer free shipping to the United States for orders over $200 USD and free shipping to Canada over $75. So support the channel by supporting yourself.